there a bigger audience beyond here?
It's going to be posted onto the honors project presentation canvas.
It's being recorded, not shared.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so no one's joining in the Zoom, but we'll be sharing it, sharing the video afterwards. So welcome to the honors presentations. I think this is the very first of the official honors presentation, so you get that honor of being first. I have known Allison Blythe for 3 years now as a student and a recipient of the very competitive internship at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that she got as a sophomore. And even though I've known Allison for 3 years, I just found out earlier this week that no one calls her Allison unless she's in trouble. Most people call her Al, so I will too from now on. So I realized I've been yelling at her on email for 3 years, so I'm very sorry about that.
He ends emails in Allison period.
Starts.
Or sorry,
Yeah.
he starts emails with Allison period. And I just feel like I'm being yelled at.
So I won't do that anymore. I apologize.
I would. You'll do it on purpose.
But Al is a senior history major and honors student, of course, and the former president of the Heidelberg Historians, which she single-handedly brought back to life after years of being a defunct organization. Her primary area of research is in First Lady Studies, which is a growing field with tremendous opportunities for young scholars, so that's very exciting. Her plan after graduation is to get her MBA through Heidelberg's +1 Advantage program and apply to archival studies graduate programs at the same time. Al's career goal is to work as an archivist, and she seems well on her way. So please welcome Allison Blythe as she presents her research on the history of libraries before the invention of the printing press.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint real quick. Okay, so let's move this. Okay, see everything. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come listen to my honors presentation today. I'm very thankful to Dr. Devine for all of his help this semester, for giving me the opportunity to be able to give my presentation to a small live audience and make this look a little bit more like what I thought it would look like my freshman year. And I would also like to thank him for all the support throughout the semester, both intellectually and emotionally. For those of you that don't know, this is my second big semester-long research project this year. The first one was Dr. Bowman over there. And without those two, I really don't know how I would have gotten through this year. So without further ado, this presentation and this project in general is titled The History of Libraries Before the Printing Press. Just as a disclaimer, the actual history of libraries is not the focus of this presentation, but instead I plan to provide an overview of my thought process going into this project, a little bit about my methodology, and the scope of the project and what I researched this semester. It's also important to note that what I have to share with you today represents the preliminary research for a much larger multimedia exhibition of the history of libraries that I plan on continuing in grad school. So this project was initially inspired by my emotional reaction to the closing of many libraries last March in the wake of the pandemic. With the closure of libraries, I worried about where students would be able to get help with their homework as they had at my local library pre-pandemic or meet for group projects, and where the rising number of unemployed adults would be able to get job search help and to print off their resumes. And also just where a sense of community would be fostered, if not at the library, through programs designed for all different ages. So with the loss of all of these resources and opportunities, in addition to just the material collections of libraries, I began to wonder how libraries have become so entrenched in our communities in the first place. I also knew that as important community centers, with lots of people that were familiar with them, that use them on a regular basis, there would be a sizable audience of people who might also be curious about the history of libraries. And to me, this made it a perfect opportunity to pick a subject for a public history project. So when it came to telling people what I had learned on the subject of the history of libraries, I knew that I wanted to do so with the tools of a public historian. A public historian differs from an academic historian in a few different ways, but The most important one is the location of the public historian being outside of the classroom or history textbook. Academic historians, their primary audience is other academic historians and people in, academic history classes, whereas a public historian can talk to pretty much anyone. Audiences of the public historian are generally not at all trained in the field, and they choose to be there rather than being required to be there for either their career or for academic credit. And so the approach that a public historian takes has to be a little bit different, and it has to focus on keeping the attention of an audience. So the easiest ways to accomplish this task are through making the display of information interactive and relevant. By encouraging the audience to participate in their own learning, and by tying it to something that they already know about, a little bit about, and they're familiar with in their own lives, they become more invested in what you're trying to tell them. Public historians also develop ways for audiences to interact with information that is self-driven and self-paced. Think about when you go into a museum. There's going to be a big sign telling you what the room or a specific display case is talking about, but then on all the individual objects, there's going to be little placards giving you in-depth information on that one thing. You, as the audience member, are going to choose how much or how little you read of that provided information. For example, when I was in 8th grade on a school trip to DC, we only had an hour in the American History Museum. And so my friends and I went through, and we were band kids, so we looked for all the instruments and we read the little placards of the instruments, and that was it, because that's all we had time for. Public historians also develop ways for audiences to interact with information that is Public historians also information in multiple forms of delivery. In my example of the musical instrument hunt, the words that we were reading was one method of delivery. The actual artifact itself was another. There was a volunteer that came and talked to us at one point to answer questions. That was a method. Other options that weren't there but could have been were audio files of the instrument being played, or just videos about them being played and their creation. The goal is just to hit as many different ways of conveying information as you can, because it's just a fact that different people learn in different ways. Public historians also provide access to primary sources or things created during the time period they're studying to the public. Studies have shown that people trust museums even more than they trust teachers and professors to give them information about history, because in a museum, they can see something and compare this tangible proof of what is being told to them to the other methods of delivery and kind of come up with their own, like, do I believe what's being told to me? And comparing the two things. So then one last aspect of public history that I will just briefly mention here is the growth of using digital technology to collect primary sources directly from the public, by having people go through their garages and attics and providing photographs and things like that, or by creating primary sources in the moment by reflecting on their own experiences with different institutions. And most people like to participate in the development of historical narratives, and creating and providing these primary sources is just an easy way to participate and do so. So how does this all apply to my project specifically? Well, I initially planned to create an interactive website for my honors project, complete with plenty of links to online collections of primary source material revolving around the history of libraries, interactive maps, and even a chance for people to create those primary sources and reflect on what the role of libraries in their own lives. While researching the history of libraries, while also reading up on copyright laws, teaching myself web design, and trying to excel in all my other classes, I realized that the scope of this project was much too big for the 4 months that I had. And so the multimedia exhibition of the history of libraries was put on hold until I had the time and energy to do it justice. And so then I focused in on doing the actual historical research and identifying my goals for the larger years-long project this semester. So thus far, I've discussed my project in terms of the final goals and where I plan to go with it later. But now we're going to turn our attention to what I actually did this semester. I don't have time to go in depth and tell you a lot about all these different historical time periods, but in the interest of providing you with the scope of my project, I researched 3 main time periods. The first was the ancient world, and this focused on 3 different geographic areas. We have the ancient Near East, which includes Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then we have ancient Greece, which also includes the wider Hellenistic world, and again, Egypt, actually. And then finally, ancient Rome. Next, I looked at libraries in medieval Europe, which was particularly fun for me because I'm in a medieval Europe class right now, as are many people in this audience. And then finally, I looked at the very early parts of the Renaissance to see the immediate impacts of the printing press upon libraries. So the bulk of my honors project paper revolves around the actual point behind public history. Public history differs from academic history, not just in the methods of delivery that we talked about a couple slides ago, but also with the overall goal. In academic history, you're studying a specific time period and you're making arguments and just trying to understand it the best that you can. Whereas in public history, you definitely care about the past and having good historical methods and research skills, but you also care about how it all relates back to the present. This goes back to the idea that public history should be relevant. For my project, libraries are something most people in the United States have some sort of experience with, which is what makes it a good starting point for being relevant and relatable for people. Public historians often use history to facilitate discussions about the present as a result of all these factors. So for my discussion of the present in my final paper, I have two broad goals. So the first is teaching audience how history as a discipline works. Under this major goal were several smaller components, including how historians actually go about crafting their arguments and how historical narratives can change over time. As a history major, I often get asked, isn't it boring and hard to memorize all those dates and people? And my answer to this question is usually somewhere along the lines of, well, I don't really have to do that, but then I just get stuck and I can't explain what I actually do in any meaningful or concise way. Everyone in this room knows that I'm a rambler. And without a plan of what I'm going to say, I'm liable to just jump all over the place. With a public history exhibition of the history of libraries, I saw a chance to explain how historians do the work they do, how they craft their arguments, how they use evidence, and explain it in a way that would be able to be understood by someone who doesn't do it on a regular basis. And especially as a way to show how historical narratives are not cut and dry and how they can change over time. The study of ancient Greek libraries, for example, has changed radically in the past 20 years. Historians have revisited the evidence that they've been looking at for decades, and they went through it all and they realized that we actually know next to nothing about Greek libraries other than that they exist. We don't know anything about how they worked, actually. By combining the different aspects of my exploration of what the field of history is actually like, the overarching argument that I will make in the final website is, and this will guide how I talk about all the individual time periods in terms of the content and the historian's rationale behind their arguments, is that the historical narratives are not set in stone, and audiences should be wary of anyone who presents history as anything less than an ongoing debate. Good historians, of course, take sides in these debates, but they also acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives, and they explain why their perspective is more compelling to them. My second overall goal was to make a guess about the fate of libraries themselves. By looking at what libraries looked like before one technological innovation of the printing press, I was able to see how such a change would affect the institution in the long term. All the invention of the printing press really seemed to do was increase the availability of different books to be purchased by more individuals and more libraries in greater volumes. And this increased the democratization of knowledge, which coincided also with the rise of literacy rates. And there has been some debate in the past few years about whether or not libraries are antiquated institutions after the invention of the internet. And through my research, the answer that I have come to for this question is a solid no. Libraries today are so much more than just a storage space for books. They are community centers, they are intellectual hotspots, and they're providers of many different types of resources, not just their material collections. In my opinion, you can all rest assured that libraries are not going anywhere, especially if enough people take the time to reflect on the role libraries have played in their lives, which is why when my website is up and running, I want to make that primary source collection of people's reflections. So I would like to thank you all again for coming and listening to my presentation today. I'm very excited about the future of this project and my future in the field of public history in general. And then we now have time for some questions from you all. And you can feel free to ask about my methodology, the history of libraries, public history, any part of my presentation. So. Sarah.
Sorry about that. How did you come up or pick the general time period of prior to the printing press in the first place?
Yes. Okay. So this actually, so like I said, this project initially started from me wanting to figure out how we'd gotten to the point that we're at now, where libraries are such a big part of our lives. And so the initial scope of the project was the history of libraries in the Western world overall, which is way too much to go through. And so then it became a process of elimination. So as you can see in this figure, this is from an article called The Subject and Historiographic Characteristics of Library History. So what these authors did is they went through the American Library Association's bibliography of library history over a 4-year period and saw where the different places that they were writing about were. And as you can see, the United States, we're looking at what, a 300-something year history, and you have 350 plus publications just in those 4 years. Whereas in Europe, I mean, you have thousands of years of history. And so it just became one of those things where it was more feasible for me to get through a reasonable amount of research and still sleep while getting through the semester, but still getting through a decent amount of the scholarship. So. One of you, Dr. Bowman.
Sure. I don't know how to word this question, but it strikes me just thinking about the practice of public history and the example of what you're doing looking at libraries. Are libraries themselves a kind of rhetoric, a kind of text, a kind of medium themselves, like a medium of mediums, if you will, right?
Yes.
That where in studying it over time, you're studying libraries not just as a kind of with simple instrumental purposes, but also as rhetorical strategies and expressions of different cultures. Then you have to get to architecture and stuff, but then, you know, how have you explored that?
So I didn't really talk about it in my presentation because it was getting very deep into methodology, but I did some reading on library history, what library history is, those sorts of things. And one of the key components of library history is that it is extremely interdisciplinary. And so like you mentioned the architecture, that's one way that you can approach libraries. You can approach libraries from book culture. Here I'm looking at it kind of before this major technological innovation, because after that it gets so complicated because there's so much more, there's more books. And so the way that they do things is obviously going to change significantly. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question.
Good enough.
Okay. Andrew, you had a question.
So I was gonna say, do you think that the reason why there's such a high publication rate in the United States is maybe not so much the history, but more so the community impact that libraries have provided that's unique to the United States compared to Europe or Asia or Africa?
Yes. So I think one of the reasons that it's so high in the United States is actually because of the Carnegie libraries. So a lot of libraries or a lot of library history is actually done on specific institutions, not libraries as a general, but as like celebratory, like, look at how cool our particular library is. And there's just a lot of libraries in the US. Like, think about Tiffin. How many libraries were there? I mean, obviously there's not as many open now, but 50 years ago, we had like 4 libraries open or something like that. And this is a fairly small town. So then you can go to Columbus, where there's like, I think 50 plus branches of the Columbus Metropolitan Library. And so there's just more libraries. And I think that's what's kind of contributing to that a little bit. Oh, also, this is the American Library Association's thing. So they're obviously going to read that stuff more. Sorry, Dr. Hogan.
No,
I just have
Oh, I didn't see your hand.
probably a quick question. It's been a long time since I took my history of library classes. Before, or in those ancient times, medieval times, were libraries used as more than just storehouses during that time? I mean, was there
There were scholarly
a public
communities.
aspect to them even back then?
There were scholarly communities that would come in. They were connected in the medieval period to different schools. And in like the Roman libraries, they were connected to the public baths in some cases. So the issue is less who can get in and more who can read. So you also have to look at the literacy rate. So in Rome, they were open to more people, yes. But why would you go in if you're just staring at it and you don't know what it says? So there were public libraries, but it was kind of a literacy issue, not a you can't walk in issue. Dr. Hogan.
Okay, it's not exactly what you're talking about here, but you did bring it up. You did bring it up as one of your tangents.
Okay.
And do you think that Carnegie's gift of 2,200 libraries, including the building we're in, of course,
Yes.
do you think that is what prompted the kind of the modern library movement, the proliferation of libraries?
I
as we have them?
haven't really read a ton about the Carnegie libraries. However, I do know how many books exist on them. And I know how many that there are in this town and, you know, all those sorts of things. So I
Right.
would say that, yes, that definitely had a huge impact on like what modern libraries currently look like, especially when you look at how he was giving them to specific communities and they've become these community centers. So that's my answer to that
Well, when
question.
he originally, well, not a lot, but a number of the original libraries were community centers.
Yes.
They were pools, they were boxing rings, they were concert halls, and the area for the books too. But I was just thinking in terms of, in the last 3 towns I've lived in, Tiffin, Marion, and Delaware, all of their town libraries were Carnegie libraries. So hence, you know, for well over 100 years now, those were the only public libraries. And I'm wondering if that was, if Carnegie created the norm of having libraries
I
in
would
American towns.
say probably, but I don't know that for a fact because my research isn't really like in the American stuff. But from like kind of what I know about like when people like mention them, like kind of like tangentially in other stuff, I would say they had definitely had a huge impact. Yes.
It's the resident non-history major. I'll ask a more basic question.
Okay.
What did books look like before the printing press?
So he's asking this because I put this slide together last night because I got.
You didn't have to out me like that.
I was gonna say, that was my question. So what I was
Yes.
supposed to come
You
for.
weren't getting
So most of you in this room obviously are either history professors or students or just like looking at old things.
Or lesser professors.
as the
Yes.
team, as the team non-history. Yeah.
But books before, I'm actually going to move myself on the screen. So books before the invention of the printing press looked different depending on what time period you're talking about, and where you're talking about. So what you see here, I was super excited when I found this particular image. This is the remnants of a tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the first things that I read my freshman year here at Heidelberg. And so when I found this, I knew I wanted to share this in some way. As you can see, it's a tablet and it's written in cuneiform, and basically you like dig, like, and it's scribes that make these, and they basically take this like tool and they scratch it. And the really cool thing about these tablets is they are super duper old. Like these are like some of the oldest like literary things that we have, and because they were written on clay tablets, when their buildings ended up being set on fire, as most things end up being set on fire, it bakes the clay and actually makes it more durable. So that's the really exciting thing here. And so up here you have papyrus fragments. I believe these ones are from Egypt. But as you can see here with the papyrus, we have less of these fragments. They're harder to, like, it's harder for them to make you know, from when they were made to now, in one piece. And so a lot of times you have these fragments of them. And then here you have, this is a manuscript, I believe this is on parchment. And it's handwritten, but you can see the start of the development of different things that help you tell what's on it. So here you have like big text this is probably some sort of title. You have big letters where like a paragraph would start. And other versions, those big portions that kind of tell you when you're moving one section to another are going to be in color, they're going to be in red. You also, I don't have a picture of them here, but like a fancy version of a book would be like an illuminated manuscript. So it's going to have like all kinds of fun like colors and stuff all over it and actual artwork within the book. So, yes.
Speaking of illuminated manuscripts, this makes me think of like monasteries as being a major player in the library
Yes.
universe. I'm wondering, and you may not have gone this far in the research yet, but to what extent does, first of all, can we identify like a starting point, like this was the first library?
No.
That's my thought, that would be the case. Now, can we also though match or map the spread of libraries or the growth of libraries in any significant way with the spread of religions, specifically religions that are based on books, right? So,
Yes.
so Islam and Christianity especially, and
Yes.
Judaism, be very connected to these books. So that to me,
There was one of the major turns in libraries from the like papyrus to the codex is actually because of the like Christianity. So no one wants to imagine like a Bible scroll, and it's a scroll, and like you have 15,000 scrolls to go through to find anything that you're looking for. These codexes, they have pages that you can turn. They're like a book. The size of our books now are based off of the size of codexes, generally speaking. And they're just much more easy to flip through. They're readable. That's why you have the addition of things like this title and stuff like that. So you can go through and find a particular book in the Bible you're looking for, those sorts of things. So it definitely impacted even the way that books were created. And then also the kind of flip side of that is that libraries grew after the development of monasteries because reading books, doing intellectual things, it was a very important part of the monastic lifestyle. There was, you know, you had time every single day where you were going and you were just reading. They would read to you at dinner, at lunch, like somebody's in charge, somebody's flipping through a book and reading to you while you're eating.
Sounds amazing.
They're like reading the Bible probably. But there's definitely books were a huge part of monastic life, and so they had to develop larger and larger libraries as more people turned to this monastic lifestyle, and because who wants to read the same book over and over again? Like, I mean, you can do that a little bit, but not for however long your life is. Dr. Hogan.
Yes, my hand was up first, freshman. Josh's question before about libraries being the aggregator of media, the kind of the conduit of knowledge, and that got me thinking, as I sometimes do. You just talked about the pre-book library, or the pre-book book. Let me ask this nicely, it's not offend Lori.
I know already, go ahead.
What do you foresee in terms of the post-book library? Or possibly the post-library era?
Yeah, well, there won't be one. but-
That's what I just argued. That there's not. I just argued that there's not going to be a post-library era,
By the way,
actually.
There are more books published now than ever before in history.
But do we need the institution, I guess this is my question, do we need
Well-
the institution of the library as the forum for
No.
knowledge, or does it come directly through the internet to the consumer?
It depends if libraries think that they're in the business of trains or transportation. And I think we're on the basis of
I knew she wouldn't like my question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Your turn.
I think that there's just something about reading something out of a book that's just different than reading it out of off the online. And even when like we read like e-journals and stuff like that, they're still published so that there's pages and you can print them out. Like even though they're not being, published, they're not being printed and widely circulated in that way, there's something to be said about the way that we read. The reason our books still look like these codexes are because of just how, we think, how we read.
And I'm not faulting that. I am Lori, close yours. I am a huge consumer of Kindle books, mind you, books that also probably appear on paper somewhere. But I have somehow trained my brain to, I have an aversion to holding paper now. I'm coming out now. I have an aversion to holding paper.
I think that I'm not like that. I think there's going to be people that are not like that. I think that a lot of people like to write in books still, especially in academic circles. And so there are definitely people that choose to read their things through ebooks, but I don't think that the printing of books is going to go away either.
I'm sure there's some kind of stuff.
Morgan, share.
One, I agree with you in that, like, there are people who, like myself, for example, I am better able to focus and absorb things when I physically have the book in my hands. I do not like reading ebooks. I do not like whenever a professor assigns like a book that's like just online to read, I'm always like, oh, because it's just, I know I'm not going to do it well because of the fact that it's online. And also, I don't think libraries are ever going to go away because there's always going to be people who don't have access to the internet. There's always going to be people who aren't wealthy enough, who maybe they don't want that technology or whatever. Maybe they're all like, as you said. So I mean, there's just like there's always going to be people that need those libraries, regardless of what greater society thinks.
I just can't afford a larger eye prescription, so I cannot be reading.
Well, I mean, also what you were saying about just all the different things that libraries do.
Right.
That we couldn't do during this, where it's like meeting.
There's other
places.
things. Like I used to go to my local library and print all the time, and I couldn't do that for the longest time.
Or
My
job
house doesn't have a
searching.
printer, like because nobody in my house knows how to set up a printer. So.
Or job searching.
Mhm.
It's a huge thing.
My mom had a question, and then I'll come back to you, Andrew.
Well, it's more talking about you growing up, as I can see this from a different perspective.
Yeah.
so, Yeah, lots of stories.
Enlighten us.
No, I was just gonna say the library definitely shaped where she ended up. She volunteered at the library when she was a young kid, and then her brother had followed in her footsteps, and the librarians there taking the time.
Yes.
It wasn't even so much about the books. So I guess that would be my question is how do you see yourself as because that's where I see you in the future is something like that public historian that how are you going to make those libraries relatable? Like you were saying, it's like if libraries can adapt, they'll stay around. It may not be for the book. I love my Kindle. I love reading books. I love just carrying my phone and reading, but I still go to the library to look up stuff, to look up the information. Of course, I'm from the generation we looked at microfiche, which you probably did. They don't understand that at all. But so I guess
Does that
that's.
still exist?
Yes, it does.
It does. I made her look it up. So
Yes.
that's how I did all my research projects was on microfiche in the downtown Columbus Library. But so how do you see your research and your website being able to adapt to like if you were running a library, how are you going to make that relatable so that the people who don't have an aversion in the paper will still come to your library?
I think it's definitely, so one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of this was the librarians. And I think that at my local library, we had a children's librarian and a teen librarian. They focused on programming for these different ages. But what really stuck out to me about the two of them was that they made me feel like a grown-up. They made me feel like what I had to say mattered. Not that my mom didn't, but there's it's different when someone outside your family it's different when somebody outside your family is like, oh, you like have important things to say, let me like sit with you and talk with you about where you see your future going. And obviously I get that a lot at Heidelberg too, because there's 1,000 students, but my high school was twice the size of Heidelberg, so I didn't have as much opportunities to talk to my teachers in that way. And so these librarians took just a direct interest in my life and helping me figure out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go to college, all those sorts of different things. And definitely helped me grow as a person. And then, so to your second point, I love history. I love interacting with history in all kinds of different ways. I think it's fun. The story that many of you have heard, my brother had this bed that looked kind of vaguely like a boat. We would sail to the New World every day. I had to include him because it was his bed. And I renamed him Clarence, and we sailed to the New World every day. And when he got sick of sitting up with me, because I'm 5 years older than him, when he got bored, he got smallpox, and I tossed him overboard.
And then you went off to college.
So history is just really fun to me. And there are different ways to interact with it that already exist through historical fiction books. I read a lot of American Girl books growing up, and the like Dear Americas, the Princess Diaries, where they like pretend that they're like princesses and they write diaries. I loved all those sorts of things. And so there are ways to make history fun. And like, that's kind of my life goal, is to like help other people realize that it's not just a bunch of names and dates, and people like, it's really cool, and there's all kinds of cool stuff. Sarah.
I just wanted to say, I actually do have a couple of those Dear America books still in my room. Like, oh, there's a couple there.
Yes, we still have the American Girl books in my house.
We have time for one more question.
Andrew.
So
You had a question a while ago.
oh, don't worry about it. So this is kind of a link that I saw with Dr. Bowen's question, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I have them am wrong, because Dr. Bowen will know. But
And I'll tell you.
and tell me even better. So, but the question I have though is that when we look at ancient libraries, especially with philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they're all at the center of these libraries, right? It was more so what we think of like almost like a university, I think. That's what you found. But what's interesting though is see how the monastery became, when the church became the focal point of medieval life, in that birth records, baptisms, death, burial, everything was by the church. And the church also was collecting scrolls of the Bible amongst other texts. So do you think though that the monastery did provide that link into public life from the ancient library, no of Rome, but in more so like the early Renaissance, for instance?
Okay, so I think that the monastic libraries definitely, they got to the point where they started opening up their libraries to different educational institutions. They were called cathedral schools before they were universities. So the cathedral schools are kind of like the prototype of the university. And there were actually laws passed that the monastic orders had to share their books because they were having issues being able to make their own libraries because there's a very limited number of books. And so it got to the point where they, had students go in, and part of what students did was they copied books from these monastic orders to put into the future university libraries. And then the idea of a private library does not go away with monastic orders. There are definitely still private libraries in the early Renaissance. That's actually one of the things that I talk about in my paper, is that I did a little bit of research in our run and rep class on the Urbino Library. So the Duke of Urbino actually owned like over 1,000 illuminated manuscripts, like really nice ones. And we still have those. When he died, they got transferred to the Vatican Library. You can look at them online. There's books of them, and they have like super cool illustrations, super cool artwork if you're ever bored and want to look at cool old stuff. So yeah, the idea of private libraries don't go away. I'm not sure if that was your question or not, but okay.
I don't think you knew what your question was. All right, please give Allison a round of applause.
It was a really interesting presentation and very interesting questions. These questions went on for about a half an hour longer than they normally do.
So that was
But-
actually the nice part of this,
Yes.
though, was that I
Since-
got longer.
Yeah, since you're the only one presenting today, we got
Yes.
to take a little bit more time. But this has been an absolute pleasure working with Allison this semester. And I probably won't be able to work with you much more in the future, but I'm glad I got this opportunity, and I wish you the absolute best of luck.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Nice job
Thank
indeed.
you. Thank you all for coming.